Hi, everybody. This is Paul Grand. I'm the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Welcome to another in our series of MedTech Innovator live broadcasts. So this week, we are very lucky to have a panel that I think you're really going to enjoy related to the topics of sales, to market access, and to supply chain. So we're going to be talking a lot about some really interesting things that will have a massive impact on your products and ultimately the value of your companies. So very excited about this. This is, again, part of our series that we do for our companies in our MedTech Innovator Accelerator and Showcase program. We have 50 companies in the main program, another 5 companies in pediatrics that are part of the program this year. And all of the companies that we're going to be talking about today are ones that have submitted their questions in advance for this webinar. So a lot of the topics we'll be talking about are based on those questions. So we're going to start off first by doing some introductions so you can meet our panelists. I'm going to start off first with Dave Uffer. So Dave's from Alira Health. He's one of our partners here at MedTech Innovator. Been lucky to know Dave for many years. Great person to have on your side. So Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit quickly about yourself and Alira Health, and then we'll move on.
Hi, Dave Uffer. I'm the Vice President of the MedTech practice at Alira Health. Been in MedTech for about 30 years, mostly with large cap medical tech providers such as Abbott Laboratories, Boston Scientific, most recently with Covidien and Medtronic. Been with Alira for about 2.5 years, where I lead the MedTech across our areas in strategic advisory and investment banking. Very core to our strategic advisory is working with clients on market access and best-in-class go-to-market strategies.
Excellent. Very good, Dave. Great to have you here. Next up, let's go to Elizabeth Mallett. Elizabeth is coming to us today from Gore, and she'll tell you all about her role there at Gore in supply chain, as well as her background. So, Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Mallett. I'm happy to be here. This is the first time on this, and so excited to meet you all. I work for WL Gore & Associates. I have currently I'm in a supply chain operations leader role for all of our new product development in our vascular category. I've spent time in our cardiac category as well. Background is in engineering. What I really love to do is set up manufacturing lines. So that's kind of where a lot of my experience comes from. I've spent the last 10 years in medical. Actually, all of it has been at Gore, but I've worked up and down from commercial to product development, all the way back to concept development and working with some startups as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Great to have you here. And next up, Scott Tackett. So Scott's currently with Intuitive Surgical. He's going to be talking to us today about market access as well as other topics. So Scott, tell us about yourself and your role at Intuitive.
Sure. Yeah. So Scott Tackett, Vice President of Global Access, Value, and Economics for Intuitive Surgical. I've been with the company for about 4.5 years. I've spent the majority of my career of 20 years working in different medical device companies. Like I said, most recently, right now with Intuitive. Prior to that, Baxter, where I was head of global market access there in their surgical care division. And then prior to that, Johnson & Johnson and St. Jude Medical. I'm a practicing applied health economist. With a background in education in both healthcare strategy and health economics from Tulane. And I also did a postgraduate fellowship at WashU in healthcare strategy and economics coming out of graduate school. So.
Very good. Well, with that background, I think maybe we can set the table by first just talking just a brief amount about some of the different areas we're going to be covering today. So why don't we start off by talking about sales. So let's start with that just briefly in the background for all of us, and so we can keep it in all of our heads. Maybe I'll start with you, Dave, as well as Scott, and you can tell us a little bit. What are some of the essential elements that companies should be thinking about, in their sales strategy? What are some of the main key elements? So I'll start with you, Dave.
Well, we're advising clients, and when I've been looking at companies developing sales strategies, it's really about how you're going to access customers, where their site of services, where they operate, how you're going to access them from a channel management standpoint, who the key influences are in decision-making criteria, and how you're going to have to train and align your sales organization. Every technology that we see has a different value proposition and a different economic or clinical purchaser. And that determines how you're going to have to align your organization as well as train them. You can't train somebody to be an economic seller down in purchasing when you have them being the predominant influencer in the purchase of a product while they're trying to work with clinicians and vice versa.
Very good. Scott, you want to comment a little bit as well about sales, since you've got some background there as well?
Yeah, and I apologize too. I should have made just a note that I am a purchaser and a shareholder of Intuitive Surgical stock, but what I'll be sharing with you guys today is not indicative of what I do at Intuitive, and obviously not what I do at prior companies and so on. So, yeah, I think that there's a couple of things. I think that the commercial organizations have evolved over the last 15 years and have had to try to evolve with the emergence of an economic buyer in the marketplace, especially in the MedTech and medical device sector. This has been common practice for pharmaceutical companies for quite some time. That dates back to the 1970s and early 80s, the emergence of HMOs and PPOs and managed care. But the emergence of the economic buyer outside the United States has caused commercial organizations to rethink that the way that they're doing it. And so to David's point, what I oftentimes think about with commercial organizations is that market access kind of plays out on two fronts. Number one is, how do I access the markets themselves, but then also get the license to hunt within that market, and break down the major adoption barriers that exist within those markets. But then secondly, how do I actually get the technology into the patient and drive utilization of the patient population that's targeted? So there's multiple channels that you're working at the same time. The interesting thing is that most of the time, commercial organizations are very much aligned to a very short horizon. They're trying to hit sales numbers for the month or for the quarter, but the market access time horizons are very, very long in particular. So, to get access, coverage, reimbursement, and to develop the evidence to support that takes many years to do. It's a concept that has to be played out, and I think it's a lot of commercial organizations are learning this as they go.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. All right, now, Elizabeth, so let's talk a little bit about supply chain. So maybe just kind of give us a general idea of, what supply chain generally encompasses, and specifically for MedTech, because I know you've got background in aerospace and other fun places.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you started with sales, because supply chains are all designed to meet the customer need. And so it's really important to have that market access and sales strategy, because your supply chain is designed around that. Those channels that Dave was talking about, I work really closely with sales and marketing at the very beginning, because I want to make sure that you got to make sure that where you decide to sell your product, you can actually get transportation to, that you have those contracts in place, that getting the product to the customer. So supply chain is really broad. So if we back up for a second, I mean, I was brought up under the supply chain operations reference model, which has kind of 5 main pillars. You have planning, which is aggregating your demand together to meet a customer demand. There's sourcing, which is purchasing, procurement, contracts with who is building your product, how you're procuring your materials. There's the making of the product, actually transforming it to what the customer wants. That's your actual product. And then there's the delivery, which is the logistics, the storing, the warehousing, transportation. And then there's also returns. Returns kind of get forgotten about sometimes, but not all. I mean, product gets damaged sometimes. And you want to think about how you're going to get that product back into your system and what you're going to do with it after that. Some key things I might kind of point out is, think about what's specific to MedTech in that plan space. Consider your lead times across your entire supply chain, not just how how long it takes you to make something, but how long it takes you to get material from your supplier, how long it takes for transportation, as you think about aggregating those demands. When in sourcing specific to MedTech, something that I think often gets overlooked is that contracting piece and really knowing where your IP starts and ends. So when you're making the agreements for a vendor, a supplier to make you something, that you really understand what you want out of that so that you don't end up with a process that you can't get data on because they own the process. They really need to figure that stuff figure it out up front. Contracting is a really good idea to have a lawyer for those contract negotiations. That's a really big piece of sourcing. The make piece specific to medical, make sure you know where your product's being built in the appropriate environment, whether in-house or out of house, that those, I mean, we've had clean rooms get overlooked before on whether or not they were validated. There's a lot of regulations there. And so knowing the regulations and communicating to your partners that you're for human use is really important. Sometimes we forget that because we know it's for human use, but we didn't communicate that, and really knowing that like, because you own the risk, you own the final product. And so taking ownership of that risk is important. And then delivery has actually quite a bit in it, from the labeling to sterilization, if you have to have a sterile product. And that transportation there can be a lot of waste in that, which costs a lot of money, makes your supply chain longer. Potentially this can really help cut costs if you are designing your supply chains up front to really meet what your customer needs are.
Well, as I think you and I, when we were talking earlier or yesterday, I said, we could easily do an hour on supply chain. We could easily do an hour on market access, and certainly on sales and pricing and other related topics. So we're going to try and hit some highlights today, and delve into some specific topics and also some specific questions that were supplied to us by our startups, because that's part of what this is all about. So another time, I would love to have a longer conversation about each of these topics. So let's start off first and talk a little bit about, go back to market access for a second, Scott. So, again, kind of as a discipline, maybe just remind us again, in addition to what you were saying a little earlier about market access, what are kind of some of the essential elements of a market access strategy?
Yeah, it's, I think you have to be, what a lot of companies will oftentimes do is they'll have a peanut butter effect, I call it. They'll try to do market access the same way in all markets, and all markets are quite unique. And so, if you're trying to do a strategy around market access, you really have to understand the root issues, barriers in these markets. So I think that the strategy oftentimes coalesces around kind of 5 major functions. One is, do I have the capability to access these markets, overcome the HTA challenges that we're going to receive, and how do I manage that effectively? Secondly is, I get coverage for my product to where I can get public and private reimbursement. So do I have medical coverage policies that prop up my product or my technology? And then obviously part of that is, in order to have those discussions with payers, you have to have a real solid background of evidence, not only through RCTs, but also real world evidence. And we're seeing the importance of real world evidence more so than what we're really doing. So, as you think about market access in its nature, I kind of call it a multidisciplinary sport. You don't go to school to get a market access degree. It's kind of time in the saddle, experiences I've had, but it's really important for organizations looking at their HTA, their reimbursement efforts, obviously policy, and then people that are working with their commercial.
Thanks, Scott. Also, by the way, Scott, there was just a comment from someone who was saying that the audio is a little bit hard to hear sometimes when you're talking. And so there's a suggestion, maybe just turn your volume down just a little bit, and maybe that that might help.
Sure.
We'll try that. But that's great. I certainly understood everything you said. All right, so let's go ahead and dig into some of the topics here, and then I'll bring up I'll bring up some specific questions, as I said, as we go. So I'm going to start off a little bit with sales here and give us, again, some specifics around sales. So, and also, I think this will apply to, probably all three areas as we go. But one of the first questions people always have as a startup is, I can't necessarily afford a Dave or an Elizabeth or a Scott or somebody who's focused specifically in these areas. So, what are some general advice that you guys have about outsourcing in general? And we'll talk about that in each of the three areas, but specifically about sales. What are some of your thoughts about outsourcing and some general tips? Because, as I said, as a startup, you can't necessarily hire an expert at the early stages. So, why don't we start with sales? So, Dave, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. From my perspective, it all depends what your overall business plan is. You have to start there and what your overall objectives. Some companies are being built for long-term play in the marketplace, and others would like to exit and sell to a larger company within a 3-year horizon. And then it all depends on what type of access to capital investment you have. That being said, my general rule is I don't like to see people go out and raise $10 million to put 42 people in the market when they're first introducing a technology. Either pilot in a region or a geography, get some experience. I think the art of it, when you mention going to outsource that, if you're going to hire 1099 or go through a local regional distributor, you really have to understand what they bring to value for you. I see too many people find companies that are excellent in a particular market space, but they might have a full bag and you might end up being number 10 out of their bag, or the economics work that they're not that highly incented to drive your technology into the market. And there's a certain art to make sure that you do have representatives that are external that can be trained and can articulate your value proposition, demonstrate and train users on your product, and that they're incented enough that it's not number 10 or 20 in the bag that they take out to sell to the customer, as well as it's the only thing in their bag because they're not going to have access and enough relevance to that customer to be able to get in front of them enough to represent your product. So I think outsourcing is very capital efficient early on. It makes a lot of sense where you can go and trial your technology, trial your messaging, as long as you have enough interaction and control within that outsourced resource.
So following up on that real quick, Dave, and potentially Scott as well. So, you mentioned incentives a couple times. So just briefly, just tell us, what are some strategies for incentivizing that those salespeople who aren't, employees of your company holding stock? Give us some just general topics there.
Yeah, if they're part of distributor networks, then it's really what type of margin you're going to give to them in as far as compensation for selling the product. I have seen examples, and we've advised in examples where you can have a host of 1099s, which are external sales reps. They're not direct employees of the company. And you can compensate them also with options at a certain level where they might be disincented to really accelerate the representation of your technologies. If they know that the company is going to be sold in 2 years, they're trying to get an early win. They're going to go where the hot customer is and then probably not grind out where they have to dig deep into probably more value-oriented accounts, but they're going to be a little bit longer of a sales turn. And if you're compensating them a little bit with some type of equity and options, that they'll follow whatever playbook you set, knowing that there's going to be reward at the end of the day if there is an exit for the company.
Great. And Scott, you have any thoughts on that you want to throw in?
Yeah, Dave said some great things. I think that number one, I think he made a great comment about the distributor relationships and so on, and that the capital intensiveness of actually trying to employ your own sales organization. One of the things that you have to watch out for is that these distributors that you might deal with is that they may not have, to his point, the long-term incentive within the marketplace to really see your product and your technology excel. And whenever you talk about market access timelines, to my earlier comment, we're not talking about quarter to quarter. We're talking about years to years to decades. And so you really have to get out in front of this with the distributor and ensure that the health of the marketplace is being cultivated and by the activities of either the distributor or your own organization. And that's why I think it's, number one, so difficult to actually outsource market access. You can outsource specific projects that need to be done in a market, but outsource the strategy and how to organize this across multiple geographies or multiple countries, dealing with distributors is going to be quite a challenge. So what I've actually found is that commercial organizations, as they look to enter a market, they're investing in market access well in advance of that.
Great. And on that topic for another moment, Scott. So you mentioned about market access and just thinking about that strategy. So when you said it's hard to outsource that. So who do you go to for that expertise early on at a startup?
Yeah, I think that number one is you really have to have a grounding of your value prop and what your value is going to be in the technology space and where that technology is going to meet an unmet need within the market. To Dave's earlier point, understanding that will start to point you in the direction of what you need to do. If you are very, very light in evidence, you're going to have to start to cultivate because it's going to be very, very difficult to move forward in market and gain access or get coverage or get reimbursement without some sort of evidence to support that. So if you need to develop evidence, that's an area where you can outsource. There's lots of good firms that can do real-world evidence or patient-reported outcomes-related studies or help you with RCTs. And that can definitely be outsourced. It's the strategy and the execution of the strategy. I think that's so difficult to outsource.
Yeah, and Scott, sorry, just on the audio again, it's still a little hard to hear you. I don't think it's the volume. If you have a headset or something that you might be able to use, like a cell phone headset, maybe that'll help. You can try that while we're switching, if you happen to have one. Otherwise, we'll make do.
Sure.
So give that a try if you want to. All right. So let's go back then to sales again for a moment. So when we're talking about a sales force, one of the questions people ask Dave is, they're too small to hire a direct sales force. Are there any particular recommendations for, types of organizations, maybe specifically, in the vascular space? Who are some of the go-to organizations people might go to in an early stage to start building out an outside sales force?
Are you asking what type of names of distributor organizations or where you can find those types of individuals?
I'm saying how do you go about identifying those organizations? And who might they, so where do you start?
Oftentimes you can find out the companies that are best representing at any medical trade show. You'll walk the floor and you'll see companies that are being represented at certain technologies, being in the marketplace and working with your key opinion leaders and where they're finding the best valued representatives that have leading technologies or a broad base of technologies in their portfolio. Of course, if you're looking for 1099s, you're more than likely going to have to hire a head of sales that is experienced with that, or use a recruiter that has a lot of experience in building sales organizations. And I think there's a certain time and place for outside help in recruiting. And other times, if you're going to at least hire a head of sales and marketing, make sure that that person, if that's your strategy to build externally, make sure that they have experience in building those. And I've seen people multiple times execute on that expertly.
Great. Yeah, no, I think the advice about walking the trade show space is a really good way to go. That's where you see a lot of those people, and it's a great way to meet them. Somebody actually asked a related question, which I'm just going to hit right now, which has to do with exhibiting at those meetings as a startup. Is that something you'd advise startups to do? Is exhibit at meetings?
That's a tough question. It really depends where you are and what you're looking to accomplish. And when I say where you are in your commercial rollout, you might go too early and get the wrong exposure. You could run into a lot of clinicians who are walking the trade show floor and want to try this, and you might not be ready for a broad-based sales experience, and you could shoot yourself in the foot and be counterproductive in what you're trying to do. They're costly, and I think having if you have a good sales organization, they can get into the early adopters just as readily as showing it at a trade show. I'm not a big fan of going too early to those. If you're looking for broad exposure, you want a dozen of strategics knowing what you're doing. You want to create a little bit of buzz. Some of the investor community hearing your name a little bit, get some press out there. That's a different objective.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears for a second, Dave, and also throw something over to Elizabeth so we can talk for a moment about supply chain, and then come back to sales. So Elizabeth, one of the things that I thought was really interesting when we were talking earlier was that you've mentioned that as part of your experience at Gore, I think it was, or maybe just in general, you've integrated, in addition to your own kind of early products that you're developing there, but you've also brought in technologies from the outside. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you're involved in assessing technologies in your role, and how early you get involved, because diligence, we used to always think of diligence as just really mainly like financial diligence and product diligence. But as I understand it, you've got supply chain and manufacturing diligence as well. So maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So when we're assessing startups from a supply chain standpoint, we're looking at, a lot of it does feed into the financials. So there are assumptions around cost. But really digging into the supply chain and figuring out where the costs are coming from. Can you get a material cheaper? Are you partnering with a supplier that's sustainable? Do you need, because there's a cost of doing tech transfers from one to the next, and they're not necessarily high. It's just really good to plan for them. So planning out and knowing what's coming for supply chain, it has been really important. Knowing so if I'm bringing something in, I'm going to look at what common manufacturing processes do I have with this company? Are they compatible? Is the process technology really easy to transfer? Is it sustainable in such a way that I can bring it in and I know I'm going to have capability still? I'm not going to lose the process, so to speak, when I move it from one plant to another. So it's all up and down that supply chain. If you remember anything about supply chain, remember plan, source, make, deliver, return. So we're looking at kind of all those things. We're probably not looking at delivery like right up front, because it does come a little bit later. There are things we need to plan for, but looking at the sourcing, who you partner with and how sustainable they are. What percent of your business, what percent of their business are you getting the level of service that you desire? It's all, to me, a business need. And really, I also look at, do you really understand what your value proposition is? Do you know the value that you bring? Is any of it embedded into those processes? And are you actively working to protect it? And what's the core competency that you're bringing? What's the unique differentiation? And has that gone through all your agreements with all the way up and down your supply chain, with your vendors, if you're contract manufacturing with those contract manufacturers? Are you protecting your competency and the unique differentiation that you're bringing to the product?
Great. And just one more question on that topic. So what are some of the things that the elements of the supply chain, as you said, you gave us kind of like the key areas, and I'm sure most startups aren't thinking that much about things like returns, certainly,
right?
And how they would ever handle that. Maybe a little bit on customer feedback or certainly adverse events and things, but they're certainly not thinking about things like returns. So so what are one of the things that are overlooked? Maybe some tips you can give us. We're trying to have these startups avoid problems that they could be dealing with today that might avoid a problem a year or two down the road. So what are some quick things that maybe you can give as tips that startups should be thinking about super early?
Yeah, it's going to go back to kind of what I said there at the end. It's know what competency you bring and the value proposition you have with your product, and ensure that those make it into contracts that you have with whoever you're dealing with. With contract manufacturers, people make sure you're talking about cost up front. Common pitfalls. Yeah, so cost up front, because, I've learned through really the hard way that companies are willing to partner and provide a service. And if you don't talk about cost up front, you might get something that's really expensive at the end and awesome, but you can't actually use it because now I'm not profitable anymore. It might tip you over on the appropriate cost of your product. And the contracts, definitely look at what's in your contract. You own it. You own your contract with somebody who's supplying you material, or with a contract manufacturer, or with those warehouses. Know what's in your contract, and absolutely drive your value. Make sure you don't lose that in those contracts inadvertently.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, well, and Elizabeth, just on the contract question real quick, obviously, as you said, you want to have good lawyers who are looking at this stuff. Is that something that, certain law firms have expertise specifically in supply chain for, and maybe even for MedTech, those kind of contracts, or is that something that you think, that most law firms should have? What's your advice to startups? Like, go specialize there, or generalist okay?
So I think you could use a generalist. You're looking at there's kind of service agreements that you're looking at. What kind of service agreement do you want and do you need? I think general attorneys can help there. I would start with general. I don't know that there are I know that we have specific, and every company I've worked for has specific lawyers that work in contract. I would talk to contract lawyers.
Great. And you've been talking about value and what value you bring. Scott, you mentioned evidence a bunch of times. So let's talk a little bit about, when you're thinking about market access strategy and the different evidence that's kind of needed in different places. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you, what you guys do perhaps, at Intuitive and just in general. I mean, I know you've got a real broad, that global access network. What does it take to really build an evidence strategy for these different regions?
Yeah, I think it's we're up to 18,000 and counting studies and opinion pieces and research has been done on Intuitive Da Vinci technology. So the evidence out there, obviously part of the challenge is understanding the evidence requirements of the market. Because the evidence required by the market can vary pretty widely. So if you're in the market, and so on, especially the clinical waiting for the evidence to be quite high. So it's going to be something that you have to evaluate in what market you want to go into.
Sorry, Scott, I'm still having the trouble with your audio. I apologize. I know you tried to fix it. If you, I don't know if you have a cell phone headset you can plug into the microphone jack or something on your computer. I don't know if that's an option.
Yeah, I don't.
If it's
yeah.
If it's not, you could try. You could try what I did and try dialing in as well. If you want to go that route. But it's just getting real hard to hear. Yeah. All right. So if you do want to try that, there's that little caret thing down at the bottom next to the phone, and you could try dialing in and just using your speakerphone. It might sound better. All right. So let me go back then to let's go back then to pricing a little bit. So Dave, talk to me quickly about setting a price. It's one of the things that people always worry about is how do they set the right price for their product. So what are some of the strategies you recommend to startups to go through to obtain a worthwhile and accurate price point?
This is one of the key elements outside of what Scott was referring to about general access, coverage, and evidence. Pricing has been a tricky one, and in the past we saw companies that would do cost plus pricing, which I think is the absolute wrong way to go about that. People set a business plan around a margin that they want to make. You see that work for contract manufacturers more so than companies bringing new technologies into the marketplace. And as you were just talking with Scott about value, you have to demonstrate some value, and then you can price your technology based around what value generated for the healthcare system, whether it's a payer, provider, clinician, or patient. And that's where we generally like to start and looking at that. Now, how you derive that value and generate what your absolute value is, that can be through health economics, that could be through clinical trial generating evidence, and that could be through real world evidence. Whatever mechanism it is, I think is a bit superfluous. It's really, what have you been able to demonstrate for the value that you generated for that technology? And then of course, the rest of it comes into how you're going to go to market, how you distribute, and really how you're going to compete in the marketplace. Are you going to shift something from a standard of care into a new technology with the value that you've demonstrated? Or are you another technology that is competing in the same clinical area with the same core delivery of technological evidence, and you're going to compete with others, and that's going to dictate a little bit of price because you have to react in a competitive marketplace.
Yeah, Paul, can I add to that too? I think David just came up with a great comment, but I think that there's some other things to consider. Pricing is obviously a very, and I think as commercial, or as you start to commercialize, you have to really understand what is the economic choice product brings to the marketplace, the cultural, the economic, and the humanistic value, all three of those. And with that, I would encourage organizations just not to let the price into the market, is to go through a process by which they really evaluate reinvestment within that market, and also within the conjoint analysis and so on. Really understand what is
I know you're making some good points, but I can't. Sorry, it's almost impossible here. I hate to make you pick up your phone, but maybe try that. I know don't worry about how it looks. The important thing is the wisdom you're sharing.
All right, how's this? Is this better?
Oh my God, it's 1,000 times better.
There we go.
All right. So now we're cooking with gas here. So what I was referring to is with David's points is I think they're great points. And I think oftentimes organizations try to put their product into the marketplace without really understanding the true value clinically, economically, and humanistically that product delivers on the market. And they also need to understand the reimbursement structure by which they're working in. By understanding those things, they can appropriately price and be more appropriately priced. I think that they still need to go through conjoint analysis and so on, and Van Westendorp models to really understand what is the price trade-offs that I'm going to incur based on decisions that my end user is going to make on the value that I'm able to deliver. So doing those things, I think, is quite important before you start to commercialize.
Great. Super helpful. You can go back to speaker in between if you want, so you don't have to hold the phone. But thank you very much for that. All right, so let's go back over and talk a little bit more again about supply chain, Elizabeth, because there's some other things that we had talked about that I want to bring up. So so you mentioned we were talking earlier when you and I spoke about things like about places like Costa Rica and other places that are in the supply chain. We had a question from one of our companies a minute ago over the chat who asked about China. So maybe we could start for a second and talk about working outside the U.S. What specifically about China. We could talk about others, but but what are are there issues today with using China in your supply chain? Is this stuff that we shouldn't be worrying about? What are you seeing on your end?
Yeah, so I think the great questions. If we talk, it depends. I mean, the answer is always it depends. So here's some considerations. Be really intentional on where you're going and why. So some people might be doing OUS manufacturing for cost purposes. Some people might be going OUS for IP strategy because patent law is different depending on where. Some people you might do it for tax purposes. If you're distributing to all over the world, or if you have to bring everything back into the U.S. I would definitely look at financial impact to that. You might be getting a cheaper price on labor, but quality is consistently an issue in China, and it's difficult. I won't say don't go to China, but there are some things you really need to pay attention to. That contracts piece is one of them. I would there will be copycat products that come about like immediately or very soon after you go there. So just know the risk you're taking on from that side. There's also quality. Some countries build, they have like around their educational institutions, they teach MedTech in terms of like supply chain things, bringing the supply chain to them. Costa Rica is one of them. Their country has been very intentional about saying, hey, we want to be really good at contract manufacturing in MedTech, and there's a lot of free trade zones. And if you walk around those, you'll see, all the big hitters, and they can hire the talent. They can hire the engineering managers, the manufacturing managers, and they really do have the know-how. In other places, you might be stuck with sending your own people because they maybe don't have the know-how to manage the supply chain or manage manufacturing or the regulatory aspect of it as well. So there's different risks that you take on by going different places. So be really intentional about why you want to go there and think about the entire cost. So you might be getting, you might be getting a lower cost on a per piece product. But how much is it costing you to manage that supply chain? Are you there, every week and you turn around and come back and then you have to go back because you have a problem? China's really far away.
China is definitely far away. And what about, as you said, somewhere like Costa Rica, places that maybe, as you said, have been more intentional. Are there other places that you're also seeing a lot of activity in MedTech supply chain?
I'm seeing things pop up in Southeast Asia, not as much China, but Southeast Asia for sure, like the Philippines and I think Indonesia maybe. I haven't had experience in the Southeast Asia region. I don't know if those are cost. I think my guess is those are cost. Those are purposeful for cost. Sometimes you also move your supply chain overseas to be closer to your customers. So if you have a really large customer base in Asia, then manufacturing everything in the United States, your transportation costs are going to be significant. And as political as it sounds, keep track of the trade policies that are happening. I know that we are constantly reevaluating those as a company because we need to be ready for things like Brexit has a really big impact to supply chain. The trade war that's going on between China and the United States also has a really big impact to the cost and to supply chains.
And the risk as well, yeah. Right? Yeah. All right, so let's talk about, and let's talk a little bit about just about outside the U.S. strategy a little more. I'm going to go back to market access again, Scott. So you're going to have to pick up your phone, but let's talk a little bit about the differences in market access as it relates to some of the differences. I know there's a ton that you won't have time to get to everything, but some of the differences in market access as it pertains to the U.S., Europe, and Asia Pacific. So maybe some of the unique challenges for those regions.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. market in all intents nature is very easy to move into for most companies and to sell products and so on. The regulatory pathway, while, we do have the FDA here and we have, CE mark across Europe and so on. The regulatory pathway within the U.S. and then once you have approval, the pathway by which to have sustainable commercialization within the U.S. is quite easier compared to other markets. So, to Elizabeth's points and to David's points earlier, really do understand where you want to go and why you want to go to those markets, because the investment that you might have to make to enter into that market will be, it could be substantial. And it might be worth it. It just depends on what your patient population is that you're going after. But the U.S. market, more easy to enter into. Some of the other markets, Germany, quite large markets, the second largest market in the world when it comes to medical technologies and device implants and so on. But it's a more difficult market to sell in. It's got unique challenges. If you go into Korea and some of these other markets, a lot of people might say, hey, would I go to Korea or go to Japan first or China or wherever? One of the unique aspects of Korea is it's not a single payer market. You do have privatization there, but you also have a very willing patient population that's willing to pay out of pocket for high technology. So that's a factor that you might want to consider. You might be able to get 20-25% market share just out of people paying out of pocket. Whereas in other markets, it's either prohibited or you have to have governmental access and reimbursement in order to enter that market, like many of the single payer markets. So these are the types of things that I would encourage people to understand before they actually move into those markets. Do the desktop research, talk to some of the local consultants, get a very experienced market access person that's done global work, and start to work down that strategy.
On a related note to that, real quick, Scott. So in terms of thinking about those single payer markets, is there I think these are things that if people aren't properly planning, startups are really thinking about creating their device, getting the first regulatory approvals and other things, and they're not necessarily thinking about those other markets. They're saying, oh, we'll worry about that stuff later. But as it pertains to some of these single payer markets, are there things that people could be doing earlier, maybe in their evidence gathering strategies, to make it easier to enter some of these other single payer markets down the road?
Yeah, with any single payer market, you're obviously going to run into some pretty strong demands around HTAs, health technology assessments. And the HTAs, back to the whole point around pricing. So HTAs, because of the types of evaluations that they will do, they'll do a very common evaluation typically, especially the single payer markets, that's called an ICER evaluation, incremental cost effectiveness ratio. And what they will do is they will analyze the price and the overall outcomes clinically and economically that product is able to deliver over a certain time horizon. And of course, price has a big impact on the ability to have an effective ICER. So, as you look at these single payer markets, they're going to have very high demands when it comes to HTAs and evaluating your technology. That's going to require deep understanding of evidence, both on the clinical and economic side. So just know that that's the pathway by which you're going to have to move through. And that's going to probably require real world evidence or RCT evidence to support those clinical and economic claims.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to jump over to Dave for a second. So Dave, maybe when we talk about things like real-world evidence, this is something that it's been a big topic recently, or maybe for the last couple of years, but something certainly that people are, it's no longer a buzzword, RWE, but something that everyone's, I think, integrating into their practice. Again, thinking specifically about startups, what are some things that that you advise people to do at an early stage, thinking about real-world evidence gathering that will help them down the road?
When it comes to real-world evidence, we're a huge proponent of that from a number of different perspectives. First off, we don't have pharma-like clinical trials that we're putting $30 million into in MedTech. We have to be realistic. And we don't have many $4 billion single product introductions. Thus, we don't have the type of budgets that pharma would have for a single compound. So clinical trials are fine that will get you either for regulatory purposes, approvals, or they can give you some evidence at post-market studies to demonstrate efficacy. However, they can be long and expensive. And oftentimes, I also find that they're in too controlled an environment, and people don't generate that same thing outside of a controlled environment as a clinical trial. And we're big proponents of real-world evidence that your product's in the marketplace, you're seeing users adopt this, you're getting experience, you're looking at real-world practice and utilization of the technology, and looking what the outcomes in those scenarios are. And you can go back and either prospectively set up to do some real-world evidence data capture, or retrospectively go back and look at what the outcomes were with those patients were and those experiences, and draw economic conclusions based on that. So I think you should be looking at the spend that you have for your clinical program, the commercial efforts that you're going to start early and through mid-stage, and when you go to build out your pro forma and say, I'm going to spend $1 million on a trial to get to this point, and then to proliferate into the market for greater expansion or coverage, what have you, that today it's been much more acceptable to look at real-world evidence, where in the past, I think payers and clinicians were saying, no, show me what you did in the trial. And now real-world evidence is being well adopted.
Scott, did you want to jump in on something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Dave's points, I think that the cost for doing real-world evidence has come down substantially. You can, in most cases, get through a large retrospective observational evaluation of using some large database, let's say the U.S. with Premier database or Truven database or whatever, for about $150,000. It's come down substantially. So to have that sort of evidence on your side where you can point to clinical outcomes and then also point to those economic endpoints within a large patient population and do very sophisticated statistical analysis will serve you very, very well long term. I can't underscore that enough. We're not moving away from RWE, we're moving towards RWE. So I would encourage all the organizations right now that are on the phone is really build the competency and the capability to develop that sort of skill set with either in your organization or partner with a strong firm to help you get jump started. The other aspect of that is that, RWE will be the future of how our medical technologies predictably, predict bad outcomes before it actually happens. So the emergence of RWE into technology will continue to drive that forward. So again, I would be investing and doubling down in this area pretty substantially.
And is that something that, again, that's something that you mentioned $150,000 to do a retrospective study, which actually is, as you said, pretty reasonable. Is that something that are there like, vendors that do like RWE as a service, or are there low cost?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that, obviously you can work directly with Premier and work with their Premier Research Services. You can work with some other firms like Boston Health Economics or Exenda and so on. So there's a number of very, very highly reputable firms that are very, very experienced in doing this. I think the important thing is get very, very organized around what is your research questions that you want to ask. What is the hypothesis test that you're looking to explore, and then drive towards that. But also have a very meaningful way to develop your evidence and understand the evidence gaps that exist in the market. Don't go out there and haphazardly just start developing evidence. Really understand where the evidence gaps sit within the marketplaces, understand the evidence requirements within those marketplaces, and invest.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to jump over to Elizabeth now for a moment. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add on, we learned this firsthand ourselves, where we have an extremely strong organization in health economics, but we were major proponents of real world evidence in theory and execution, but we didn't have the capabilities from the data sciences to be able to lead those engagements and led to us actually making an acquisition in Europe of a data sciences company. And you need that capability, you need that access, you need the data to be able to do that. So as you are going out and look at organizations that can help and be providers to you, and make sure you have an understanding of what they have readily at their fingertips for personnel and technology and data, because it's only as good as the fidelity of the data that they're accessing.
Yeah. Yeah, to Dave's point too, you know, a lot of us think that we have to go out and we have to purchase large databases to do this sort of work. There's no reason why you also can't work with your hospitals that you're looking to engage early on in your clinical trials, collect that data, set up a registry and so on, and understand the types of elements that you need to collect on the clinical, economic, and even the humanistic value. Really understand what is the impact that this has on the patient population, their time to return to work, their ability to be productive, their ability to have access, pain-related outcomes, and how we address the opioid epidemic here in the U.S. These are all really, really important things, and I would encourage everyone to think small and not try to boil the ocean on this.
Good advice. Thank you, Scott. So, you know, as we always do, so our main broadcasts are only an hour. And then we also have 30 minutes of time for focused Q&A with the startups in our program. So we only have a couple more minutes here. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of just quick questions. So Elizabeth, I'm just going to start with you, if you don't mind, and just one quick question, and then also maybe a closing thought from you. So the question I have is, and if this is a quick answer, then we can go into one more question. But one of the questions that someone asked was about just-in-time supply chain, and that concept. Is that something that the question was, how feasible is that as just-in-time supply chain in thinking about entering new markets? How feasible is that?
My experience is that it is not as feasible. You're definitely focused at the very beginning about serving customers, and if your forecasting is right on, then just in time is going to work really well for you. But it's difficult to know exactly how a launch is going to go, especially in a new market. You need a plan for upside and downside. So just in time, in my experience in medical, it has had less value. I don't want to say it's not important, because I do like just in time type of thinking, but sometimes the value isn't there, especially at the beginning.
Okay, great. And Elizabeth, also one last thing here, and then one of the things you and I talked about was the concept of scaling, and it's something again that most people aren't thinking about. They're like, oh, someone also worry about those things, but maybe just real quick, what is some advice you can give people that they can be thinking about now that might help them scale down the road, going from 10,000 units to millions of units? Are there any things they can be doing to at least prepare for that or be thinking about that as a startup?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on where you are and the confidence that you have in your forecast. So that's that plan piece, aggregating that demand together and really knowing. So it's good to have that information and get that together so you know what you're planning for. When it comes to scaling, a lot of it has to do with time and investment. How much money do you have to invest in multiple lines? And where do you want to bring up those lines is another question. But it really depends on what your what your business objective is. So if you know you're going to have to scale, really quickly over a 2-year period, a new line every 6 months for 2 years, make sure your process can scale, it's capable, it has a short time to validate the line. Yeah, I'd look at time and investment to validate and bring up a manufacturing line.
All right, and then last thing for you to close here before, and then we'll go to the other panelists, are just any particular any particular mistakes that you think people should be avoiding as it comes to supply chain? Again, maybe it could be about, having the right person on the team, whatever it might be, the expertise, but any last advice you want to give people as it relates to supply chain before your part closes out?
So I think know what you bring to the table and don't let anyone take that from you. Also, in every contract that you make, and I meant to mention this when we were talking about regions to do contract manufacturing, a quick Google search actually can yield a lot on the capability of contract manufacturing in that region. And so if you need something specific, if there's a certain process that you're looking for or a certain talent pool, you can usually, you can get that out. Asia is good at some things. Southeast Asia has some capabilities in other places. Central America has some advantages as well. And like Mexico is different from, Honduras and Guatemala, and Costa Rica is even more different. And so know when you're intentional about creating your supply chain, make sure that you know what value you're getting from those things. Don't just do it because it's cheaper. There's also a value that you can get from it, whether it's a more experienced labor pool or a higher quality product, or know what you are getting.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Scott, if I'm going to go to you for a moment. So what are some things that, maybe just again, some last advice that you might give again to startups about things they can be thinking about now as it relates to market access early on that will really save them time and increase their value down the road? So last tips.
Yeah, I think that one of the tips is invest early in market access. I would not wait until after you've launched into the markets and then you start to figure out that you have major barriers to overcome and you're stalling. Because I think if you do it right and you invest in market access early, even before you launch, your success of those launches and your adoption of the technology will go much, much more smoothly. And I know that this is a new area for many people, but don't shy away from it. Is really lean into it, make the investments, get market access on your team early on as you look to move into these markets, and approach it smartly. And don't try to spread yourself too thin. I think too many organizations, they try to launch in too many markets. Know the quick ways that you can gain success, and use that early success to underpin your product with further evidence and so on to go have the tougher conversations in other markets. Because there are markets that you're going to have some pretty significant barriers and challenges, and it's better to address those with strength than with weakness. So that's what I would say, Paul.
Thank you very much, Scott. And then Dave, last tips from you for startups, things that either maybe just from all the questions and all the things we've been talking about today on this broadcast. Are there any things that really struck you that you want to share before we close out with the public broadcast?
Yeah, a little bit to piggyback off of what Scott was just saying, and two elements. Number one, market access. We look at over 14 different factors when we do market access work, and every one of them isn't relevant. There are a few major barriers to commercial adoption, to a rollout strategy, and to greater utilization. And you have to be able to quantify the impact and the ROI from investing and reducing those barriers, which are critical to your success, which ones are going to have the best impact and your penetration into the market and the greatest ROI, because you're not going to be able to afford to expertly reduce every single one of them. And some are going to have greater impact. Some of them will be complete showstoppers, and those are important. Of course, they're paramount, but the other ones, some of them are irrelevant. Understand which ones are most impactful to your technology, your business, and your commercialization strategy. And also, to piggyback on Scott's point about getting in as early as you can, we're even advocating a little bit earlier. And I don't want to be an infomercial for AdvaMed, but I know all of the MedTech Innovator companies are invited to the top 50. We're actually putting together, under the Excel leadership program on the first day, a panel talking about getting market access into the R&D process. Because we see clients that are developing technologies that haven't taken market access factors into consideration, and they might develop a different technology had they looked at market access factors. In other words, you might need to be more highly differentiated. You might get better penetration. You might have higher pricing, and vice versa. You might not be able to attract this particular market. You need to strip it down, make it a little more basic. You're going for something that's going to be a 6-year development and regulatory and reimbursement program that is going to outpace the market adoption rate. So we're trying to advise people to even put this into their R&D process, so they're making appropriate technologies that they can then expect to commercialize in a significant way.
Thanks, Dave. And thank you for that commercial for the AdMed conference and for the Excel forum on the first day of the conference. That's September 23rd. I highly recommend that people attend that event. It's one of my favorite of the year. And specifically what you're talking about, some of those sessions are highly interactive in places that people can really learn a lot. So I hope certainly all of our stars will be there, and I hope others who are watching this will as well. So I'm going to close out the live broadcast, and then you guys all stay on. Don't go anywhere. We're going to do some more Q&A with our companies. But again, thank you very much, panelists. Dave, Elizabeth, and Scott, thank you for being here today. It's been really terrific, and I know our startups would love to talk to you afterwards. So is that all right if people want to reach out to you and at some point if they want introductions to ask some follow-up questions? Is that all right as well? Yep, nodding heads.
Absolutely.
All right, very good. All right, great. All right, so I'm going to close this out, and everybody stay on. For anyone who's watching this broadcast who's not part of MedTech Innovator, please tune back in next week, medtechinnovator.org/live. We're going to be having a great panel on M&A, so make sure you tune back in for that. Thank you all, and this concludes the live broadcast for